Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today we're doing a deep dive into The Truths We Hold, An American Journey by Kamala Harris, which came out in 2019.
And for this analysis, we're using this memoir as a very specific kind of lens.
Exactly. This isn't about biography or a campaign.
Uh,
We're looking at it as an insider's account of how identity, law, and the institutions of government really shape moral choices.
and the possibilities for reform from within those corridors of power. I think that framing is just essential to keep in mind here. Memoirs from high-level political figures, prosecutors, senators, anyone in that world, they're always doing two things at once.
Right.
On one level, it's a personal story, it's the who I am narrative for the public, but on a much more structural level, it's a justification.
A justification of the institutional roles they've played.
Exactly. It's an exercise in framing their choices within the constraints of the system.
Sure.
Basically, they're arguing, look, here's why I chose to work inside this broken system, and here's how I tried to change it.
And it's so interesting that she says that almost explicitly herself. She states right in the preface that the book is, and I'm quoting here, not meant to be a policy platform.
Right. No detailed legislative agenda.
None. Instead, it's a collection of stories and ideas from her life, from her journey through the legal and political systems. It feels like an attempt to build a foundation of trust through that narrative first, before she gets to any of the big structural arguments.
So our mission today is strictly systems level. We are going to dissect the institutional constraints she identifies, the opportunities for reform she pursued.
Whether that's in the courts, in regulatory bodies, or in the Senate itself.
And we'll connect all of that back to this central theme of what democratic participation actually looks like. We're here to understand the mechanics of power, really, and the limits of what one person can do inside these massive, often very resistant institutions.
To really get her perspective, I think it helps to just quickly map out her career path. Her trajectory is, it's a very consistent upward climb through the criminal justice system and then into major elective office.
Okay, so where does she start?
She begins as a deputy district attorney in Alameda County. From there, she runs for and wins the district attorney job in San Francisco.
And after that, attorney general for all of California.
For 2 terms, yeah. And that whole path culminates in her election to the U.S. Senate in 2016.
And it's worth pointing out that this idea of working within the system, but for the purpose of reform, that's a long-standing theme for her.
Oh, absolutely. Years before this book, back in 2009, she wrote another one called Smart on Crime, a career prosecutor's plan to make us safer.
So even then, she was focused on moving past that old tough-on-crime rhetoric.
Exactly. Moving toward something more data-driven, more about preventative institutional practices.
Okay, so let's talk about the context for this book, The Truths We Hold, because the timing is just, it's so critical. It really shapes the entire book's sense of urgency.
It really does. The emotional starting point for the whole narrative is election night, November 8th, 2016.
A moment of just profound political shock and, I think for many, a feeling of systemic stress. It challenged a lot of assumptions about how democratic processes were supposed to work in the U.S.
And she's living this incredible duality on that night. On the one hand, she wins this huge personal and institutional victory.
She becomes the first Black woman to represent California in the Senate.
And only the second in the entire history of the country. But that massive achievement is almost instantly overshadowed for the presidential election results. The book really captures that whiplash, that systemic shock wave.
She describes waiting for the results with her family and friends, and her husband, Doug, shows her the New York Times probability meter just sinking.
Yeah, confirming what they were all starting to feel in their gut.
Yeah.
That this was going to be, as she puts it, a long, dark night that was going to fundamentally change the whole landscape of American governance.
And the anecdote from that night that really captures that sense of rupture, of things breaking, involves her 9-year-old godson, Alexander.
Oh, it's just a gut punch.
The child comes up to her trembling, crying, and asks this question. Auntie Kamala, that man can't win. He's not going to win, is he?
I mean, that's just a moment of pure intergenerational fear. The immediate sense that the system is no longer stable or predictable.
And her answer to him becomes the key metaphor for the whole book's thesis on political action.
It really does. She doesn't give him false hope. Instead, she asks him what superheroes do when the villain seems unstoppable.
And he says,
Through his tears, he says, they fight back. And she leans into that. She says that's what they have to do, and that all the best superheroes have big emotions, which sort of validates using your personal conviction to fuel your actions within the system.
And that moment dictates everything that comes next for her. She literally throws away her prepared victory speech.
Yeah, the one that was written for a totally different national outcome.
And when she gets up in front of her supporters, she poses this very direct question, this immediate call to action. Do we retreat or do we fight? I say we fight. The whole memoir is basically structured as a handbook for that fight.
And then there's that one detail that brings it all back down to a human level.
The Doritos.
The Doritos. She gets home, finally, and just sits on the couch and eats, quote, an entire family-sized bag of classic Doritos. Didn't share a single chip.
And that's not just a funny detail. It really underscores the immense emotional and psychological toll that responding to this kind of systemic upheaval takes on the people who are actually inside the institutions.
Right. And this whole emotional scene sets the stage for how she frames her political identity, which is very much in that classic tradition of the political memoir.
It's all grounded in this idea of speaking truth.
Mm-hmm. She argues that the fight for the country has to begin and end with speaking truth, that trust in our institutions has to be reciprocal, and that requires being brutally honest about the massive systemic failures.
And she lists them out very directly. Racism, sexism, wage stagnation, the cost of healthcare, and especially the destructive force of mass incarceration.
And she doesn't stop there. She expands that truth-telling to include the predatory corporations that have turned, deregulation and climate denialism into a kind of creed. She's suggesting that these entities are operating either outside of or sometimes through the democratic system to cause harm.
So this is where the core thesis of the book really comes into focus. It grows directly out of that context of institutional stress and her personal conviction.
Right. The democratic participation isn't passive. It's not just a philosophical idea.
It depends on people understanding their own indispensable practical role inside these institutions, whether you're a voter or prosecutor, and actively choosing to engage, to fight for reform instead of just withdrawing when things get hard.
And she drives that home with a quote from Justice Thurgood Marshall.
From his 1992 speech.
Yeah. America must get to work. We must dissent from the indifference. The whole memoir is framed as a response to that call, an attempt to translate those high ideals into actual, practical, institutional strategies.
Okay, so let's transition into the heart of her career and the core tension of the first half of the book, which is this idea of the progressive prosecutor. Choosing to work inside a system that she admits is fundamentally flawed.
And she's very candid about that. She acknowledges that America has a deep and dark history of using prosecutorial power as an instrument of injustice.
We're talking about things like framing innocent people, hiding evidence.
Exactly. Disproportionate application of the law.
Yeah.
She knew firsthand the deep cynicism her own community felt toward the criminal justice system.
So this gets to the critical question of institutional compromise, doesn't it? If you know the system has this dark history, why on earth choose to become a prosecutor?
And that's the central question she tries to answer. She explains it was a very conscious decision to get a role on the inside. Her goal, as she puts it, was to be the person who could let them in when activists came marching on the doors.
That's a fascinating insight into that dynamic. It recognizes that external pressure from activists only really works if there's someone on the inside with agency ready to receive it and act on it.
Right. But you raised the key point. That choice requires compromise. How does the book deal with the tension of trying to reform a system while also being its chief enforcer? Because that's a tension that many of her critics have focused on throughout her career. She doesn't really deny that tension. I'd say it's the organizing principle of her whole philosophy. Her argument is that abandoning the system means abandoning the vulnerable people who actually need its protection.
And she has a story that illustrates this, right, from her early days.
A really defining moment. It was during an internship in 1988 at the Alameda County DA's office. She was reviewing a case from a big drug bust and realized an innocent woman, just a bystander, had been wrongly swept up in it.
So what makes that a systems moment?
Yeah.
And not just, a simple mistake that gets corrected?
It was the human stakes that revealed the structural cruelty of the system. It was a Friday afternoon. If that woman wasn't released right then, she was going to spend the entire weekend in jail. And Harris says she had this instant realization of the cascading consequences.
Loss of a job.
Loss of her job, loss of dignity, and the terrifying possibility that Child Protective Services could get involved, putting her kids at risk. all from a simple mistake. The system was designed to crush, not to correct.
So what did she do? She's just an intern at this point.
She knew she had limited power, but she also knew what leverage she had. She ran down to the clerk of the court, begged, pleaded, and got a 5-minute window for a judge to get back on the bench.
And it worked.
The judge reviewed it, and with the pound of a gavel, the woman was free. She got home to her children before the weekend.
That's incredible.
And for Harris, that was foundational. It proved to her that even a small, determined intervention from a compassionate person inside the system could stop that huge, grinding flywheel of incarceration. It showed her that justice wasn't just about winning big cases. It was about protecting the vulnerable.
And this seems to be what led her to challenge what she calls the false choice narrative in criminal justice.
The tough-on-crime versus soft-on-crime binary.
Right. She argues it's just a political tactic meant to stop any real reform, not a reflection of how justice actually works.
Exactly. She insists that a functional justice system has to weave together two different, but not mutually exclusive imperatives.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is non-negotiable consequence for serious crimes: homicide, sexual assault, violent felonies. She gives the example of a bill she championed in 2004 that lengthened sentences for Johns paying for sex with underage girls, treating it explicitly as child sexual assault. Zero tolerance for that kind of predatory behavior.
But the second imperative is different.
The second is about addressing unfairness, recognizing that the mass incarceration crisis is driven by systemic things like addiction, poverty, and desperation. And in those cases, the focus has to shift from punishment to help, to rehabilitation and prevention.
And that distinction is what led to her big institutional innovation as DA in San Francisco, the Back on Track program.
Right. Back on Track was a program designed specifically to interrupt that systemic cycle of people going to jail, getting out, and going right back in.
The recidivism cycle.
A huge problem. She points out the U.S. leads the world in per capita imprisonment, and something like 70% of released prisoners commit another crime within 3 years.
Because they face these huge systemic barriers when they get out.
A dual barrier. They have a felony record, which blocks them from jobs and education, and they often lack the skills to survive outside that criminal environment. It is a cyclical trap built right into the structure of post-release life.
So what were the mechanics of her solution? How did Back on Track actually work?
It was a really rigorous, highly structured program, kind of like a boot camp, but for nonviolent first-time offenders. But there was a really crucial institutional constraint right at the beginning.
The participant had to plead guilty first.
Yes, they had to accept responsibility. Why was that so important for the program to function?
I'm guessing it had to do with political cover.
That's a huge part of it. That guilty plea was the institutional price of entry. First, it maintained the integrity of the justice system. It established accountability, so the program couldn't just be dismissed as soft on crime.
And second,
it allowed the court to legally suspend the sentence and divert the person into this intensive program. And the incentive was huge. If you completed it successfully, your charges were expunged.
a clean slate. True economic redemption.
Exactly. And the program itself was so comprehensive. It wasn't just a few classes. It was GED courses, parenting classes, mandatory community service, detailed financial literacy training.
And it required buy-in from outside the system too, right?
Critically, they partnered with Goodwill for job training, got commitments from the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce to help graduates find actual jobs, worked with local trade unions.
So it was this multi-institutional collaboration, re-engineering the system to support success instead of just punishing failure.
And the results, the metrics, made the case for this kind of institutional change undeniable.
What were the numbers?
After 2 years, only 10% of the Back on Track graduates reoffended.
10%. And what was the rate for similar offenders who went through the traditional system?
About 50%. A staggering difference. And the economic argument was just as powerful. The program cost around $5,000 per person versus over $40,000 to keep someone in jail for a year.
And that success had a ripple effect, institutionally.
It was huge. It proved that a focused local reform could generate national systemic momentum. The Obama Justice Department ended up formally adopting it as a national model program, a perfect example of a bottom-up feedback loop forcing change at the federal level just through pure evidence.
This focus on poverty as a systemic punishment also seems to be why she made cash bail reform such a priority when she got to the Senate.
Oh, absolutely. She describes the system as fundamentally criminalizing poverty.
She has some numbers on this that are just shocking.
They really are. The median bail in the U.S. is $10,000. For context, the median savings for a working-class household earning $45,000 a year is only about $2,500.
So the system basically guarantees that most people who are detained can't afford to get out.
9 out of 10 can't. And that economic penalty is then compounded by systemic racial bias.
Black men pay 35% higher bail than white men for the same charge.
And Latino men pay nearly 20% more. This isn't just a coincidence. This is the system operating as designed, using money as the only determinant of freedom.
So what was her legislative strategy to tackle this in the Senate?
It was a masterclass in building a cross-partisan coalition. In 2017, she introduced a bill co-sponsored with Republican Senator Rand Paul.
An unlikely pairing.
Very. The goal was to encourage states to replace cash bail with a risk evaluation system instead.
Now, that's a political victory, finding common ground with someone she, quote, vehemently disagrees on most things with. But does the book get into the structural resistance? Because replacing cash bail with risk assessments can introduce its own set of algorithmic biases, can't it?
She acknowledges that. Technology isn't a magic bullet, and new systems bring new problems. But the core philosophical argument they united on was that your freedom shouldn't depend on how much money you have.
Detention should be based on your risk of danger or flight.
Exactly. Not on your bank account. The big systemic hurdle was political inertia and the powerful bail bond industry lobby. So by aligning the bill with a conservative principle, evidence-based, efficient government, they could bypass that tough-on-crime rhetoric, even if the implementation would need careful monitoring down the road.
That makes sense. The institutional logic had to shift first.
Okay, let's pivot from criminal justice to economic regulation. Her time as Attorney General of California seems to show a really similar philosophy when it comes to corporate accountability.
It does. It's the idea that you can't rely on individual ethics or moral appeals to check the power of these massive corporations. It has to be a function of regulatory power.
And her team had a nickname for her that kind of gets at this, right? Yeah, the internal joke was that Kamala meant get more commas in that settlement price. It really underscores her priority, using the power of the AG's office to levy significant, painful financial consequences to deter future misconduct.
And the fight against the big banks during the Great Recession is the big case study here.
A huge one. In 2011, when the national settlement talks started over the foreclosure crisis with banks like JP Chase, she took this incredibly risky institutional stance.
She refused to join the initial agreement.
She walked away. And her main argument wasn't even about the money. It was about a critical legal constraint. California was being asked for too broad a release of claims.
Meaning the agreement would have let the banks off the hook for things they hadn't even investigated yet.
Precisely. She was adamant that if her office was going to sign, they needed full disclosure and real concessions, not just a check.
That must have created immense political pressure. She was holding up this huge national settlement. How did she manage that balance between regulatory power and market influence?
She was very aware of how powerful her words were. When she finally wrote the letter announcing her refusal, a move that could have caused major market volatility, she waited.
She waited until Friday evening.
After the markets had closed. A really calculated move to show regulatory savvy. She didn't want to be accused of grandstanding or tanking share prices, but she needed the message to be crystal clear. California was not going to be pushed around.
The pushback must have been intense, though. She describes some stunning legislative resistance, even from her own party, when she was pushing for the California Homeowner Bill of Rights.
That anecdote is so important for understanding institutional inertia. She tells this story of a Democratic legislator who was trying to rationalize the foreclosure crisis.
What was the rationalization?
The legislator argued, unbelievably, that the foreclosures were good for our local economy because they created jobs for painters and gardeners who were hired to fix up the abandoned homes.
That is just powerful illustration of institutional cynicism disguised as economic pragmatism.
Absolutely. So with that kind of internal resistance, how did she get the bill passed?
This is where that feedback loop of external pressure becomes essential.
Exactly. The fight needed mobilization from outside the halls of power. And organized labor groups became the key players. They became this permanent counterweight to the banks in Sacramento.
They mobilized their supporters, crashed the phone lines in the legislature.
Showed up in huge numbers, and they sent this powerful message. They were fighting for workers' dignity, not just their wages. Harris notes this made it clear to legislators that if they sided with the banks, they would have to answer to labor. It shows that external, grassroots action is the fuel that gives internal actors the political capital they need to overcome that systemic inertia.
Okay, let's dig deeper into that systems mapping. Let's talk about identity and incentives. She points to the usual motivations in politics, career advancement, public trust, but she really emphasizes this need for political legitimacy.
And that was a huge issue for her in her very first major campaign for DA in San Francisco. She started with, what, 6% name recognition?
Just 6%. She had to overcome that deficit through intense personal grassroots campaigning, connecting with voters one-on-one, famously setting up an ironing board as a campaign desk outside grocery stores.
But the personal identity that really shaped her perspective, the bedrock of her legitimacy, long before she ever ran for office, is maybe the most defining part of the book.
And she attributes so much of that to her mother, Shyamala Gopalan.
A breast cancer researcher who immigrated from India in 1958 for a PhD at Berkeley. Her mother's life is framed as this ultimate act of self-determination and love, defying the expectation of an arranged marriage.
And she meets Harris's father at Berkeley while they're both active in the civil rights movement.
And her mother's mantra for her daughters was just critical. Fight systems in a way that causes them to be fairer, and don't be limited by what has always been. You can draw a straight line from that to her decision to become a prosecutor.
Her mother also understood the systemic reality of America, that the world would see her daughters as black girls.
And she was fierce about making sure they would grow into confident, proud black women. She immersed them in the black American experience while still honoring their Indian heritage. And that dual identity immigrant striving and the struggle for racial justice really formed the foundation of her worldview on systemic inequality.
It also meant that her childhood was physically located right at the start of the civil rights movement.
She has these young memories of a sea of legs moving about, of the energy and shouts and chants from marches, often from a stroller.
And there's that famous story of her as a toddler at a march, fussing, and when they ask her what she wants, she yells, "Freedom!"
It's an early narrative that grounds her political ambition in that historical fight for justice. And another key institutional space for her outside the home was the Rainbow Sign Cultural Center in Berkeley.
This was a vibrant black cultural center that hosted people like Shirley Chisholm, Maya Angelou, Nina Simone.
Giants. And for her, it acted as a kind of alternative educational system. It exposed her to these incredible leaders and solidified this understanding that artistic expression, ambition, and intelligence were cool. That success wasn't just about personal achievement, but what you did for the community.
So if we connect that historical identity to her later actions, we see these really clear examples of that feedback loop, where external pressure from social movements drives internal institutional reform.
Yes, she's very clear that when you're advocating for policy on the inside, you need that sustained pressure from activists on the outside to give you the political capital to get it done.
The body camera example is perfect for this.
As Attorney General, she required body cameras for state law enforcement agents. And she gives explicit credit to the Black Lives Matter movement for creating the intense pressure that gave her the space to get it done on the inside.
So it wasn't just a moral choice. It was a political calculation that the external environment had finally made the internal reform possible.
To really break down that mechanism, the external pressure protests, media, it raises the political cost of doing nothing. And when the cost of not reforming becomes greater than the cost of reforming, someone like the Attorney General gets the leverage they need to push through something that previously faced impossible resistance from, say, police unions.
And this connects to her idea of showing the math.
Right. Her belief that institutional leaders have a duty to explain their logic to the public, not just announce the result.
She uses the analogy of a closing argument to a jury.
It's not enough to just tell the jury the result is 8. You have to methodically show them that 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 leads categorically to 8. When you're transparent like that, you give people the tool to decide if they agree, which builds trust even in disagreement. It helps stabilize the system during periods of change.
So let's pivot to the present-day implications of all this, especially how the deep flaws in the justice system undermine its own legitimacy and, paradoxically, public safety.
She argues pretty forcefully that the system is permeated by both explicit and implicit racism, and that this systematically erodes public trust. And she backs it up with some staggering statistics that show these are institutional patterns, not just individual failures.
For example, the data from Missouri showing black drivers are 85% more likely to be stopped.
And nationally, police are 3 times more likely to search the car of a black driver than a white driver. These are data points that reflect deeply embedded systemic behaviors.
And the outcomes in court are just as biased.
Black men use drugs at about the same rate as white men, but they're arrested twice as often for it and get sentences that are nearly 20% longer. Overall, they're 6 times as likely to be incarcerated. That kind of structural inequity just destroys the system's claim to being impartial.
And the consequence of this bias creates these massive, not-so-obvious safety problems. She argues that the fear created by things like indiscriminate immigration raids makes vulnerable communities less safe.
It's a critical point about systems failure. She cites studies showing that Latinos are more than 40% less likely to call 911 when they have been a victim of a crime.
Because they fear that reporting the crime will result in them being treated like a criminal.
Exactly. So the very system designed to protect people ends up creating an environment where predators can operate with impunity because their victims are too scared to come forward. It makes everyone less safe.
The book also gets into this interesting paradox of modern politics, the absolute necessity of a personal narrative to establish your legitimacy.
Yeah, she describes her own instinct to avoid talking about herself. She saw it as, quote, something narcissistic, which came from her mother's focus on service over self-promotion.
But she learned pretty quickly in that first DA race that voters demand a personal story.
Especially in an era of low institutional trust. They want to know who you are on a fundamental level to even begin to gauge whether you're legitimate enough to wield power. The system now requires leaders to personalize their convictions to bridge that trust gap.
And finally, she frames participation as this indispensable duty, especially when democracy is under stress. The 2018 Supreme Court confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh is the big recent example of a system under enormous strain.
The stakes felt huge. She and her colleagues were framing it as the potential dismantling of rights related to the Affordable Care Act, corporate regulation, reproductive rights.
The institutional battle felt like it was already decided, but then external action managed to disrupt it.
Centered around Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. She decided to testify out of a profound sense of civic duty, even though she was facing death threats and incredible personal risk. Her courage injected this moral weight into a system that was trying to run purely on procedural politics.
And even more directly, the book highlights the power of external actors to literally stop the process.
The protest by 2 survivors of sexual assault in the Senate hallway. They confronted Senator Jeff Flake in an elevator, and that moment, that confrontation, effectively paused history. It secured a delay for an FBI investigation. It proved that determined public action at a key pressure point could work when all the internal deliberation had failed.
And even though the confirmation went through in the end, the institutional impact wasn't fleeting.
Not at all. Dr. Ford's testimony led to a 200% increase in calls to the National Sexual Assault Hotline that day. It echoes what happened after Anita Hill's testimony in 1991. Even when you lose the immediate institutional fight, the movement gains powerful momentum, and deeper structural change often follows later on.
So stepping back, let's connect all this to our broader themes. The tension between systems and individual morality seems key.
It is. Harris holds on to this optimistic belief that people are fundamentally good. But you contrast that with institutional inertia, the tendency of big systems to resist change because the status quo is just easier.
So change requires this continuous, structural effort. Good intentions are not enough.
Right. She quotes Constance Baker Motley on that. Lack of encouragement never deterred me.
And this ties into how institutions absorb reform energy. She talks about testing the hypothesis in government.
Which means being willing to take bold, data-driven, sometimes risky actions. She says political capital doesn't gain interest. You have to spend it and be willing to take the hit. If you just sit on it, you lose it.
And this idea of spending capital on solutions applies at every scale of government. She has this incredible example of data-driven micro-reform.
It's such a great story. An elementary school principal in Sacramento figured out that truancy in elementary school was the start of the high school dropout pipeline, and the most common cause.
Lack of clean clothes, the shame and absence that it causes.
So the principal's solution was just so simple and so bold. She installed a washer and dryer on campus for the kids and their families to use.
And the result?
In the first year, attendance for those students went up by 90%.
90%. That story might be the key insight of the whole book. The true systemic barrier is often mundane, non-obvious, and a targeted, data-driven micro-reform can outperform these huge policy mandates that ignore the human-level constraints.
That's it, exactly. And this all comes back to the book's title, The Truths We Hold. She frames the fight for systemic fairness as age-old. And she knows that progress isn't linear. Victories can be lost, and lost battles can be won later with a renewed effort.
And she offers this final definition of what a patriot is. It's not about passive acceptance of the system as it is.
No, it requires active engagement, even when that means criticizing the existing power structure. She says, a patriot is not someone who condones the conduct of our country, whatever it does. It is someone who fights every day for the ideals of the country, whatever it takes.
That is the ultimate call to duty inside the system. And this final reflection really shows why democratic systems rely on these continuous participation narratives to survive. The book ends on a note of optimism, but it's not in the systems themselves.
It's in the external actors who challenge them. The young activists from Parkland, the dreamers, the determined sisters at the Women's March.
Like her parents who pushed her in a stroller at civil rights marches, today's activists bring their own babies.
Believing, despite all the evidence of entrenched power, that a better future is possible for us all. It's that sustained, truth-based belief in fairer systems that fuels the fight, even when institutional inertia makes it all feel impossible.
The Truths We Hold is, at its core, a guide to navigating and trying to reform these powerful, flawed institutions. It helps us see the role identity plays inside these systems, the limits of individual agency without collective action, and why sustained, truth-based participation is really the only way to secure democratic legitimacy. We really do encourage you to read the full text. Our deep dive today was based on The Truths We Hold, An American Journey by Kamala Harris.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.